Hello again, welcome to another video. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about shutter speed and all various ways that it affects your images and maybe some ways even how you can use it creatively. I'll be warned though, this is going to be a bit of a longer video as there's going to be a bit more explaining to do when it comes to shutter speed. So let's get to it. Now, like I've mentioned in a previous video about how aperture works, which you can see in the description if you haven't seen it already, shutter speed controls the exposure image, where the longer the shutter is open, the more light will be exposed to the film plane or sensor, where a faster shutter speed will be open for less time, letting in less light. Now, you may be wondering, what shutter speed should I use? Well, to be honest, that is not really a question I can really answer, as different shutter speed will be required for different situations. Now let's take sports photography for example. For the most part, unless you're doing panning shots, which I'll get to later, you'll want to use a very fast shutter speed to kind of freeze the motion and make sure you get a sharp image without any blur. But whereas for some things like landscapes and that, let's say you've got like the clouds going by and that, you may want to use a very slow shutter speed, maybe even 30 seconds or longer, to blur the clouds to create a very dramatic looking image. But in terms of slowest shutter speed, they usually, most like photographers and that and schools will tell you that you should never use less than a 60th of a second handheld. Now personally, I can use about a 30th getting away with it without image stabilization, whereas obviously if you have an image stabilized lens or body, you can usually use a lot slower than a 60th of a second. But like I said, I can use a 30th handheld without any real like camera shake or blur in my image. So I think the best thing for you to do is to kind of play around with shutter speeds that and find out what you're most comfortable with. But you know, you might have quite shaky hands and you might not be able to use even a 60th, you might have to use faster than that. But like I said, you'll just have to play around with it and kind of see what works well for you. Now for anything slower than a 30th of a second, I would definitely recommend either using a monopod, stable image, that's like a tripod but it's only got one leg, or use a tripod to make sure you get a stable shot. The main thing that shutter speed affects is going to be the motion blur of your image, where a slower shutter speed will usually give you more motion blur, and a faster shutter speed will give you less motion blur. And like I pointed out before, a sport photographer may want to use a fast shutter speed to freeze the motion to get rid of as much motion blur as possible, whereas something for landscape where things aren't moving as fast, they can get away with using a slow shutter speed because it won't turn into a blurred mess. Now, to come back to sports photography, and particularly motorsport photography, let's say you're taking a picture of a car whizzing by very fast. If you just held the camera still to take a picture, it would look very blurred. The car would look totally blurred out and it wouldn't be a very good image unless that's what you were going for. Now, what a lot of sports photographers and definitely motorsport photographers do is panning. This is where, as you're taking the picture, you follow the subject, keeping the subject in the frame to keep them sharp, but blur the background and the wheels. This will create a very interesting image. But just remember, you don't always have to use panning for just sports and motorsport photography. You could do it in a wide range of subjects if you wanted to get something interesting. Now, to show you how shutter speed affects your images in a bit more of a controlled manner, I'm going to take some pictures of the fans on my computer here to kind of show you how different shutter speeds affect your image. Now, for the first image is a picture of the fans totally stationary, so you have a reference of what they look like normally. Now, this first image was taken at 1/400th of a second. This is relatively fast for how fast them fans are spinning. As you can see, the image still looks nearly frozen, nearly if there's still. You can still make out all of the individual blades and the vents on the inside of the fan. Now, for the next image, it was taken at 1/200th of a second. As you can see, the blur now is a bit more pronounced. You can kind of tell it's there, but it's still not so blurred that you can't make out all of the individual blades and vents. Now, the next image taken at 1/100th of a second. Now, the blur is now a lot more pronounced, and you can you're starting to blur the blades together, and it's looking, well, obviously like it's spinning very fast. Now, for the final image, taken at 1/50th of a second, this is now very blurred. The whole fan blades and vents look nearly blurred together into one mess, because depending on what you're shooting, you may want a bit of motion blur or a lot. That's going to have to come down to your personal preference, what you want this to look like and what will work best. Now, to wrap things up, I'm going to show you a few images of my own using shutter speeds in different ways to get certain effects. Now, this first image is an example of me using shutter speed to freeze the motion in an image to get a sharp shot. The reason for this shot, I wanted to use this, was because the bike was coming out of the corner very fast, moving about a lot. So a slow shutter speed with a conventional panning shot would have probably have either not been able to get a sharp shot at all or been incredibly difficult. Probably too difficult for my own skill level, but there you go. Now, obviously, like I said, the bike was moving very fast, so I used a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second. This was to obviously get a bit of blur in reels, a little bit of blur in the background to keep the image interesting, but still fast enough to freeze the motion of the bike moving about. Now, the next image is going to be a prime example of a good panning shot. This was taken at 1/125th of a second to get a lot of background blur and a lot of blur in the wheels to isolate the subject and make that the main focus of the image. Now, like I said, the car was moving relatively fast, but not too fast. Sometimes it's better to go to a slower subject and use a slow shutter speed rather than trying to go for still a relatively fast shutter speed and a very fast car. This will be quite difficult in most cases, but like I've said, the subject is isolated because of the large amount of blur in the background, and the blur in the wheels really does convey the sense of speed and motion in the image. Now, for the final image is going to be me showing you shutter speed being used in a way different manner. For this image, this was shot at dark with very minimal lighting. It was just a few street lights around, so there was very little light. I had to obviously use a tripod, unless I wanted to use ridiculously high ISOs, which would make your image very grainy. And I also wanted to stop down the aperture to keep the subject in focus because I was using a long focal length. So, at this point, I found myself I was having to use a shutter speed of 30 whole seconds, which is a long amount of time. Obviously, for this, you obviously do need a tripod. I wouldn't think of ever using it handheld. You know, it could give some interesting images in some cases, I don't know. But, like I said, this is a long time for the exposure, and because there were cars going by behind the vehicle, the brake lights and the headlights were creating these interesting light trails. Now, that was just to add a bit more interesting in the image, because I thought it would like kind of make something interesting in the foreground, but a lot of photographers, they actually do whole light trails. They'll pretty much set up looking at a road or a motorway. Usually motorways work best because you get lots of cars. You do a long exposure at night and you get lots of light trails. On one side you get actually white light trails from the headlights, and then the other way you'll get red light trails from their brake lights. Now, this will usually create very interesting images when it's done right. Sometimes it's a bit overdone, but for the most part it does create a very interesting image. Now, that's going to have to be it for this video. I hope you got a bit of a better understanding of how shutter speed works and how it affects your images. So, leave a like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it, maybe check out the description for the video I mentioned earlier, and just check out all my various social media platforms where you can see more of my photography, and that will be it for today. Bye!